A legislator does not have to explain himself. Justice Douglas said in a great Supreme Court case once, being arbitrary and capricious is the essence of legislation. That is what it is. It is compromise. It's not principled.
Chris, since studying with Ed Banfield and Jim Wilson and studying and working, I guess, with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, what surprised you most about the evolution of American government in the last 30 years or so?
The things that surprised me did not surprise me at the time. It's not that there was a lived experience of observance, but during these years, in retrospect, looking back at, say, 1970, I graduated from Harvard in 1968.
Right.
I worked in the Nixon administration, and take from that period through the present, there have been programs that have been tried and that have failed. We've tried to improve healthcare policy, and there have been ups and downs in every area of domestic policy. But the two great changes, transformations of government, far beyond anything anyone could have predicted back then, have been the growth of administrative government. The fact that government today is, we've actually achieved what Woodrow Wilson wrote about, that we've put aside policy making by parochial and ill-informed legislators who are merely representatives of the people. We've set aside supposedly outmoded constitutional strictures and turned over policy making sent to a very large degree to the executive branch, populated by hundreds and hundreds of specialized agencies with very wide discretion to make, enforce, modify law, and monitor the people subject to it. That's an immense change. It's a constitutional change, but it's also a change in the nature of society and the extent to which we are governed by rules rather than representative general laws. The second is, which I believe is related, is that public finance has completely come apart. In the early 1970s, the Congress lost its old seniority system, the old hierarchies, and embarked on a new set of very decentralized procedures for controlling the federal fisc, and discipline collapsed completely. And we are now in a world where very large deficit spending, not for wars, not for public investment, but just for conventional public spending, which is mostly income transfers today, is the norm. It's not. You will find partisan differences. Republicans say they hate it. Democrats will say it's not so bad, but everybody votes for it in the end of the day. So these are two enormous institutional changes in our government that each provides grave risks, presents grave risks.
Let's talk about the first one first. The rise of the administrative sector, or the administrative state, sometimes people call it. Is this a problem? I take it here's the question: is this a problem that goes back to the 1930s, or is this a problem of the 1970s? And there's obviously, it didn't begin de novo in the 1970s. There was a lot of administration already laced into things, but something changed in the 1970s.
There were three phases, and at each phase one can argue that there were intellectual causes, and you can argue that there were material and economic causes. The first phase was Woodrow Wilson progressivism, the result of long-standing study on his part, which when he was propelled into the political arena, he could make a matter of not just writing books, but of practice. He believed that the separation of powers, the constitutional restrictions were incompatible with governments being responsive to the problems of the modern world. And he believed that a lot of the problems could be solved by politically neutral, we would now say, expertise, scientific men rather than representative politicians. He was quite forthright about this, but not a lot happened. There was the Federal Trade Commission, there was the Clayton Act, but it was more talk and political debate than action. Action awaited the Depression, when, as part of the New Deal, the president embraced a huge variety of direct administrative controls over the economy, some of which, such as the National Recovery Act, were held unconstitutional, but most of which survived in the form of commissions for regulating communication, radio and television communications, and financial markets, and other matters. We think of these as great liberal progressive initiatives, but one of the great achievements of the 1930s was to regulate trucks, so that you could not load a bunch of cabbages in a truck for somebody else and haul them from Arkansas to Tennessee without the permission of the federal government. That's something that we learned to do in the 1930s.
Overseen by the federal government?
First of all, the government would not give you permission because somebody else was already hauling cabbages and would get all of his customers to come in and say that one's enough. But if you did get in, we would then set your prices and make sure you couldn't undercut the incumbent. Anyway, we had, and I don't want to make fun of all of it. There were severe crises during the Depression. The causes were not well understood. Roosevelt had a big problem on his hand. He was trying everything. He was extemporizing. But most of the extemporizing was done through administrative agencies. These agencies, though, worked mainly through licensing and adjudication. The third great moment began in 1970 with the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, OSHA, and many other agencies. These were fundamentally different from the New Deal agencies. They did not act through adjudication. They did not decide whether Kessler or DeMuth got to haul cabbages from Arkansas to Tennessee. They made rules covering the whole economy. They didn't do so in trial-like proceedings. They did so simply announcing to the world that this is what we're going to do to require changes in the manufacture of tires in America everywhere, or how power plants would have to be designed and implemented.
And did they ever have to give a reason why for the change, the drastic change in format?
They borrowed
commissions to single member or not, single director sort of rulemaking?
Yes, they borrowed from legislative practice and judicial practice. It was a hybrid. They had to, the faux legislative aspect of regulation was you had to collect comments, like a congressional hearing. You'd propose a rule and you had to have everybody come in and give you their comments. Some people would be for it, some people would be against it, everybody proposed changes. So you had to listen to the people. There was a sort of a democratic patina to what you did. Secondly, you had to explain yourself. And not only did you have to explain yourself, but there was this mild requirement that your explanation had to be not arbitrary or capricious. It had to be cogent. and reasonable.
Yes.
A legislator does not have to explain himself. Justice Douglas said in a great Supreme Court case once, being arbitrary and capricious is the essence of legislation. that is what it is. It is compromise. It's not principled. The rules had to be explained. Like a court, there was a rationality requirement, a very low
That's
rationality,
a minimal
but
requirement.
you had to explain yourself. But if you did those two things, you could make a law that imposed costs of hundreds of millions of dollars, far beyond anything seen in the New Deal. And this was a far more efficient form of lawmaking. It was an astounding innovation, and it was really the beginning. And as I say, it began in about 1970. It was the beginning of the administrative state that we know today, which is caught up in so many controversies where President Obama and people in his administration simply make announcements of changes, and in their case, changes that actually aren't authorized by statutes, that have immense consequences for millions and millions of Americans. Sometimes they announce these changes through by email, with no formality at all. And sometimes they don't explain them at all, and they haven't collected comments. Now, maybe they've collected comments among a favored few, but we don't know. So in recent years, we've moved, I think, to another level of administrative practice, but the great acceleration began in the 1970s.
But the amazing thing, in a way, in as open and democratic a culture as ours, is that this transformation is largely not understood. Would you agree with that? I mean, it's understood in the Beltway. I'm not sure it's really understood in political science textbooks. I don't think it's well communicated at any rate, and it seems highly unlikely that the public at large recognizes just how much of the mass of law that they live under is not in fact statute at all, but simply regulatory. Isn't there a democratic deficit, you might say? In this?
I believe that that's the case, but the Tea Party has been an important phenomenon in American politics. It is certainly populist. It is not. It's not a elite operation. It's very much grassroots, and restoration of the Constitution is one of their strongest arguments. Now, in a lot of areas, I would say they're more concerned about the debt and financial issues.
Right.
But if you listen to them on the financial collapse and all of the bailouts of 2008, which were highly discretionary executive decisions to bail out one firm, not to bail out another, done without congressional authorization or approval. You can see some intimations of that, and some of the complaints about President Obama's changes in immigration law, welfare law, have struck nerves. Now, how many people are sort of, I don't want to, how many people are complaining about the exertion of executive power as opposed to just disagreeing with the policies
Sure.
of President Obama?
Sure.
Not clear.